Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. We're going to get started, and we are recording, and this will be accessible after. And just want to get started here. Welcome to TAO's next session of our Member Resiliency Series with Representative John Lively, State Representative of District 12. Just want to start by introducing myself. I am Sally Bell, and I am new to TAO as of 3 weeks ago. I am the new VP and Executive Director for the Southern Willamette Valley, and pleased to be here with you this morning as my first live webinar event with TAO. So just a few reminders for rules of engagement before we start. Everyone's been muted, so please remain on mute unless one of our staff members, which would be Justin Martinez this morning, before he unmutes you and calls on you to talk. Secondly, you may ask or respond to questions in the chat box publicly or privately by directing your message to Justin. We will monitor the chat box and respond throughout the discussion. And lastly, we'll ask you all to engage via the participant icon on your screen. Social media is a great way to engage with us, and we encourage you to post during the call and throughout the day, and we appreciate your social support, and you can see where to find us on this slide. And due to the limited time, so we're going to end promptly at 9 a.m. this morning, we will capture all questions in the chat and shift any unanswered ones to Mobilize, which is our member engagement platform. And if you're not yet familiar with Mobilize, it's our member-only virtual community. And we'll post any unanswered questions on Mobilize today from our members there to keep the conversation going after the event. And if you have any questions about joining Mobilize, please reach out to Justin, whose email is here on the screen. And if you have any questions about joining TAO, we would love to have you come aboard. We have lots of really interesting and innovative options for this fall. So please reach out to our membership email. We want to thank, oh, and there's Justin. So please reach out to Justin for any questions. We want to thank Portland State for their support of this resiliency series. They underwrote it, and they've been a great sponsor and partner. Thanks to Portland State. And before I get started with our speaker for this morning, this is just a quick reminder about future programming. So next Wednesday, we have Speaker Senator Lou Frederick, who's going to be speaking with us on the 6 bills centered on police reform that passed last month and what Oregonians can expect to see next. So right now, we're going to introduce our speaker today, and it is my pleasure to introduce Representative John Lively. Representative Lively has spent his career as a public servant representing residents in Springfield, Oregon, with terms on city council and as mayor prior to joining the Oregon House of Representatives. His private sector work spans manufacturing, construction, and the semiconductor industry, and he's currently chair of the House Interim Committee for Economic Development. And we've got a beautiful set of questions, thanks to many of you participants submitting those ahead of time. Thank you for joining us today, Representative Lively, and we are going to get started on our questions. So welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, here's our first question, which could probably take up the entire time. So just so you know, we've got about 11 questions. We'll see how far we get. And the first question is, what are some of the key responsibilities of the legislature when it comes to economic development in the state of Oregon?
So first and foremost, I think one of the key legislative authorities or interest is in supporting economic development throughout the state, both cities, counties, private businesses. So the important thing that I think we need to understand, the state is not in the business of doing private business. The state is in the business of supporting private business to be successful. So we're really focused in 3 areas. One of those is infrastructure. So the state works with local communities to ensure that there's funds available to provide the infrastructure, whether it be sewer, streets, cable TV, whatever the case may be, that those infrastructures in place to support private business investment to help those private businesses be successful. Secondly, the state has programs in place from an economic development standpoint to fill gaps, financing gaps and other gaps that are required in private business making investments, and hopefully support, again, the efforts of the private sector, whether it be private banks, all the lending institutions, the cities and the counties, to be successful in supporting businesses. And third is, and this will probably, people say we don't do this very well, and we don't, but to minimize the impact of the regulations, because the state is a regulator, but to try to minimize and understand the impacts of those regulations so that businesses can be successful. And that's not something the Economic Development Committee deals with directly, but something we look at and try to influence where those regulations and that are going to understand the impacts of the cost in that. We spend a lot of time talking about that, but those are kind of the three general areas that the state plays a role in economic development.
Thank you. So more specifically to the House Interim Committee for Economic Development, can you share with us some of the initiatives that the committee's been focused on in the past few months?
Surely, and so that, as everybody can appreciate, has changed as the impact of the coronavirus has changed. And so during legislative days, and all of this is happening remotely, which makes it a little more difficult from the standpoint of the committees to be able to meet. But during the last legislative days, the committee was really focused on immediate things that the state could do to help businesses both not just survive, but to reopen. And that in the first emergency board session led to the state entering in with the $10 million to set up grant programs, not loan, but grant programs to complement what's going on out in the areas to try to get funds to business to offset both the costs, the immediate costs that were created by businesses having to close, for those especially that didn't get the federal PPP money. And then secondly, to start helping businesses that to try to reopen to address the cost, the increased costs that are part of doing that. So that was really our focus. That was not our focus when we left the session in March, but obviously the focus changed somewhat because of the virus. Since that point, I've had a work group. So the committee again has worked on two things: expanding the $10 million program that was originally started with state funds and including up to $25 million of the CARES money, again, to distribute throughout the state to reach those businesses. And in this case, we're focused on businesses of 25 or fewer full-time equivalent employees. Really focused on businesses that are entrepreneurial, single ownership, women-owned, minorities, rural, trying to make sure that we reach around the state with these funds. Again, they're grant funds, so getting the funds to those businesses that haven't got previous support or got minimal previous support in order to sustain them during these reopening phases. And all of this, of course, is based on continuing to reopen and businesses trying to be successful. We also, the committee, we had a work group of the committee that focused on the venues and the cultural arts throughout the state of Oregon, and made a recommendation to the E-Board that was adopted by the E-Board to try to distribute $50 million to support those venues throughout the state. Again, the intent, as we focused in the interim on the Economic Development Committee, is to try to be sensitive to the different needs throughout the states, because they vary, rural versus urban and so on. Sensitive how those needs are different. The requirements might be a little bit different, but to ensure that every region of the state that we reach with some kind of opportunity for these grants to provide what support we can. We can't provide enough support for everybody, but target those in areas that are the focus of the regions versus what we necessarily think the state. All of those things are in place. We'll continue to monitor those, but that's what we've been doing most recently.
Thank you. That actually helped address one of the pre-submitted audience questions about city versus rural. So thanks for addressing those. So looking forward from your perspective, what are the priorities being talked about for the coming months?
So in the last couple of sessions, but in the short session especially, the committee's been working on first trying to understand. So many of the programs the state has in place that supports economic development were started a decade ago or 2 decades ago, in some cases longer than that. So first, we're trying to understand, do those programs really support the types of businesses? Because we know business has changed a lot throughout those decades. And so do the programs we have in place still support those businesses? Or if they don't, can we modify or change those programs, whether they be tax incentives or direct investments in loan subsidies, whatever the programs may be? Can we modify those to better support what we know the structure of business today is versus when it was implemented? But we've been spending quite a bit of time on that. If not, then should those programs be eliminated? Because there's still people taking advantage of those. But given the limited resources the state ultimately has to make those investments, should we eliminate some of those programs and implement new programs? So we've been doing quite a bit of look, and then we'll keep doing looks on that. Kind of goes back to, secondly, kind of the economic development department, and from the standpoint, is it structured in a way that can be most responsive? So what we've learned during the pandemic and knew before that, all state agencies have a struggle with adapting quickly and changing to changing conditions. And so this is not a criticism of those departments, it's just the nature of things. But we know during this pandemic, that's caused all kinds of problems getting money out and doing things quickly. So what we want to make sure going forward is, so is the structure we have in place and what we expect of the economic development department appropriate, and how do we better support it? Their funds come from the lottery, traditionally, is what supports economic development. We know those funds have dropped off substantially, so there'll be a question about, until the funds start coming back, are there other things the state needs to do to help the department with those programs? And then I'm going to go back to this regulatory thing. So we've talked quite a bit, and we'll continue to talk in the Economic Development Committee, especially during the next session, about, so what is the cost of regulations overall? And I'm not talking just about the financial cost, but the time cost to businesses from all the regulations that we put in place with the best of intentions at times. And are there things we can do to mitigate or to change those regulations to make it easier for businesses to be successful while still protecting the safety of all the citizens of the state of Oregon, or even other businesses in that. So there's quite a few things to look at. But all of that's really going to be based on where we're at come next session starting in January. So, and the coronavirus, and how successful businesses have been able to sustain themselves and recover to when we reach that point.
Thank you for that. Switching gears a little bit, can you tell us what the committee is doing when it comes to equity and more underrepresented parts of the community?
Sure. So that's in both rounds for the coronavirus response in that. And even before that, we worked with the department to prioritize and focus on minority-owned businesses, people of color, women-owned, those that are disadvantaged from location. So when I say prioritize, we got to be very careful. We can't just say that's where the funds have to go, because that violates the tenets of the Constitution and the law. But we put in place, from a standpoint of the department and our regions, requirements that they do outreach in different ways in many cases to try to make sure they're reaching those communities, make sure they're working with, whether it be chambers of commerce that represent minority groups or Latinos, all of those other organizations out there that in many cases represent businesses that fit those categories. So make sure that they're reaching out to those to try to identify where those businesses might be. And then again, putting in place requirements from the standpoint of proving to us how much outreach has been done, tracking from a standpoint of showing, so how many businesses did we reach, how many are single ownership or entrepreneur, how many are women owned in that, to get some sense that indeed our efforts are successful. Understand this is difficult from the standpoint because we don't necessarily have statistics before that tell us how many we're reaching. All we know is nationally, we know that we haven't done a very good job. And we do know in recent times that specifically women-owned businesses and minority businesses have been disproportionately impacted by not having access to these programs. So we put in place the guidelines, the priorities, that's what it is. That's what we require of those that we put funds out in the communities to try to make sure they reach, and then we're tracking that to see how successful we are. But we know we're not going to change this overnight to being as successful as we'd like to be reaching those communities.
Thank you for that. Another question here. In what ways would you like to see philanthropic foundations, the private sector, or other groups complement the state's efforts when it comes to priorities and initiatives?
So we've learned more about that again during this pandemic, which has been interesting. So early on in the process, the philanthropic organizations got together. And in fact, before this, they've been joining funds together and that in order to have funds available to directly invest in startup business and that, which I think is wonderful because we always know there's a lack of enough capital to help especially fledgling businesses in that. And so working through the Oregon Growth Fund and that, and with the Oregon Growth Fund, those organizations have put together capital that they can invest directly in businesses. During the pandemic, they put together money in that they could roll directly out to help support the small businesses to survive in that. So I think that's an example how we can better collaborate in the future so that those kind of programs, because in some cases, the limit on the state funds and how we can invest, it keeps us from getting to specific areas that private sector investors and the philanthropic organizations in particular can get to. So how we put state funds and then how we can take those gaps that are still out there and the types and sizes of businesses in some cases might be where that's at, but then use the private sector investments to complement and also fill the other gaps. So remember, the state's goal all along has been to fill gaps. But we can't reach everybody because of some of the restrictions we have on how we spend the funds. But private sector investments and or philanthropic, I think that they can. And that in many cases is what's happened in the past in local areas, whether they be economic development corporations or others, that they've been able to, if through private donations and things, do some things that we can't do with state funds. And so I think we've set some examples during this pandemic that hopefully we can expand on going forward that will ensure, again, more, especially the startup businesses, that we're able to identify more funds to help them be successful.
Sure, thanks. Here's a question that came from the audience ahead of this event from Karen Anderson. Thanks, Karen. Is there anything that's being relaxed right now to help the economy? For example, fast tracking zoning or to anything to that extent?
So there's those requirements that are required in cities and change process, what's required in that to get through the process to try to fast track in that. But the state doesn't really play a role other than the overall guidelines that local regions have to follow to have those. So we have the top code in that. The state has relaxed in specific, but like I say, I know of some local regions in that have done some things as far as waiving system development charges and doing things of those natures to try to both offset some of the costs, but also the fast track permits. But from an economic development standpoint, we haven't been involved at the state level at this point making any major changes. So those are always things that go back to, that's on the agenda longer term. So are there more of those things? But so I come from mayor and working in local communities. So I'm always pretty protective of the community's rights to make those decisions versus the state. So we could at the state say you have to relax certain zoning codes in that. I don't think that's our role to do that. We have made some changes as far as zoning codes to encourage infill, different types of housing in R1 zones. So we do those kind of things, but it still relies on the communities to go out and engage in how they ultimately apply those in their areas. So.
Yeah, and are there any advocates you'd recommend? Who are our best advocates in helping some of the planning and the zoning process? That's another question that came from the audience.
So I'm partial. So I, in Lane County, ran the economic development nonprofit for long years. So first and foremost, I think the closer you can get to your communities, whether it be at the county or the city level, if there's economic development corporations, in many cases, there's advocates within those organizations that have the title of economic development, something in their thing, and that's what their role is in many cases. So it really needs to be done within your local community or your local region. But I know there's a lot of economic development nonprofits throughout the state that advocate on behalf of businesses, and one of their roles is to be that advocate in with the permitting process and that. So I really encourage people to find out who those organizations are, or specifically those within cities and counties that have that as part of their duties, and work with them to facilitate that process. Understand at the end, cities and counties are still regulators too. And so even if you have an advocate doing that, there's certain rules, things you still have to follow, but in many cases it can speed the process up by both understanding and having somebody kind of overseeing those applications.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And here's another audience question, which I'll read verbatim. It may be open to interpretation. This is from Mark Lawler. Thanks, Mark. What is the road to economic recovery with more than half of the citizens of the state acting as free-range chickens?
Right. You know, that's a great question, and I wish I had an immediate answer. I'm one of those that believes that that whatever the science is telling us is what we should be doing. And the science absolutely is telling us that we got to social distance, we got to wear masks. So I can tell you, when I'm out in public, I'm pretty frustrated when I see those flaunting it. Some people, I understand, aren't necessarily flaunting it. They think they're doing it, but there's some people absolutely still do. And so first of that, I think, is just ongoing communications about how serious this is, the nature of this, what the risk is if we're not able to do more to not just bend the curve, but to end this until we can get to a vaccine and those things that are necessary. But all of that can, it's just messaging, reminding people to do that. But I think the real risk, and this is where I'm going to say, the real risk from my standpoint, where we've come, is if we don't do those things, social distance, wear masks, don't meet in the groups and that, we're going to create an economic disaster different than we had before, because businesses are still struggling already, trying to recover. And if they have to close back down, I mean, we're going to lose a whole bunch more, and the recovery is going to be much longer. And I think people just need to understand that. But the only answer in the near term is, we can put all the rules in place we want and tell people, but unfortunately what we're seeing happening nationally and even in Oregon are there's people just saying, I don't have to do it. That's my individual right not to. I'm one of those, we don't have enough police in that, and we wouldn't want to use the police to go out and do that. We just have to rely on people ultimately getting the message what the real risk is to all of us, both our health and safety and the long-term economic viability of our businesses, that we just need to do those things that science tells us we need to do.
Absolutely. Well, we've got about 5 minutes left. I have a kind of a non-economic development related question, which is just really around virtual conferencing and how that has become our key mechanism for gathering. And Representative Lively, do you have any interesting or funny virtual conferencing mishaps that you've seen in recent weeks with your team or family or constituents or colleagues?
So there's a couple.
Has that been working for you?
Yeah, so I find this very interesting because there's different formats. So we have Zoom, we have Microsoft Meet, we have all these different ones. So depending what it is, I've had difficulty in sometimes closing. So a couple things happen. What I've found when my computer updates, and I need to tell it to quit doing that sometimes, is sometimes it turns off the sound, sometimes I can't go through the same connection I always did, and so I'm trying to get into a conference but at a certain time, and it's just this frustration thing. And so then I call in on my phone to have my phone in it. So that's one of the things I've learned is that. Secondly, unfortunately, in my area, my internet's unstable. And so it goes up and down, and sometimes I get disconnected. So we're in the middle of having a conference and it disconnects me and I have to go back and reconnect. So that's pretty frustrating. But the most interesting, so my wife's involved in an organization, and she's decided correctly that they should use Zoom or one of those things because they can't get together and meet. So she agreed to get the application and to learn how to use it and set these up. So she wanted to test it with me. We're in the same house here, to test it with me. And so as we were trying to do this, what we found we were doing was running back and forth to rooms rather than trying to make the Zoom thing work on the computers. It was easier to get up and forth and go back and talk to each other until we could figure out how to do it, versus the fact, had we not been in the same house, I don't know how it would have worked. Because I don't know much about Zoom other than I connect to meetings and that and know the codes and that. She's already become a better expert than I have on that, but it was nice that we were in the same building that we could go back and look at each other's computers and figure out what was going on, or we could finally figure out how to use it. But thank goodness we have it, because the committee meetings and things we've done, as you know, we only had one special session so far where we met in person. Many of us are pretty hesitant about meeting in person, so this makes it pretty nice. My only frustration is it is not a very good way to get a lot of public engagement in the processes and that, but we just have to do the best we can do, but thank goodness we have it available.
Absolutely. I'm going to end on a positive note here, and thanks to all the participants for joining us this morning. We have more in this resiliency series, and we invite you to connect again. What is giving you hope in these times? Where are you drawing your inspiration, Representative Lively?
So those people that know me would know that in most cases I'm drawing it from my family. So I'm fortunate I have my grandchildren living near me. And so even though we don't get together very much, I can walk by and see them in their homes and talk on that. And so my daughters, my grandchildren, my wife. So first and foremost, my family, but the children, I guess, is what gives me the most hope. But, you know, this is so unfortunate what it's done to their education and that, but just to listen to them and talk and know that they're still excited about trying to learn and to get back to normal, but also to know that the young people, the older young people that are our future, and in many cases being very creative with how they adapt to what's going on in that. So I have, to me, it's the younger is what gives me hope that they'll help figure this out. We'll get through it, make some decisions and that, but they're ultimately the ones going to have to make it successful, because they're going to be the ones carrying it on after we get through this, and hopefully learn the lessons that some of us didn't know before we got into this, so that we don't repeat. But family is the thing that gives me the most hope.
Thank you. Well, I think we'll end there at 8:59 and let folks get to their 9 a.m.s. So thanks all for joining us this morning. We're grateful for you spending these 30 minutes with us, Representative Lively, and we hope you continue to engage with us on Mobilize and social media, and we will post these questions, and we're grateful for your time this morning. So thanks, everybody. Enjoy your Friday and happy weekend, and thanks for joining TAO.